All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. My name is Justin Grote. I'm a data center solutions architect and Microsoft MVP. Today I'm going to be showing you about how to create custom remote transports with PowerShell. So this is going to be a topic that is going to be delve a lot into C# and a lot into some pretty advanced nifty stuff. If you were in Andy's presentation next door and you understood it, then you're in a better place than I am and you'll be right at home. Otherwise, you're going to see a lot of kind of crazy stuff. Don't freak out. There's going to be a lot of kind of real deep dive type things here, but it'll be, hopefully you'll learn a little bit about not only like a bit about how PowerShell remoting works, but also see this really neat new feature that's been made available in PowerShell 7.3 that now opens up a lot of possibilities for connecting to PowerShell remotely. Again, very much want to thank all of our sponsors here at PSConfEU, Chocolatey, Centino, Patch My PC, and ScriptRunner. Without them, we don't have this lovely venue. They've been just such a great support, and I'm just so happy that they've been able to support us. Also, thanks to my employer for sponsoring my travel. Allied Digital is a global MSP. Our general value proposition is that you don't generate your own electricity by running on a hamster wheel. You don't do your own plumbing. Increasingly more, you don't really need to do your own IT in terms of the infrastructure aspects. So part of the reason I'm so big into PowerShell is because we do infrastructure automation across a large variety of clients, and that's sort of where I really find my value in PowerShell and has boosted my career. So if you have an infrastructure or anything that you're interested in, possibly taking some of the load off so that you can focus on your core competency, maybe give Allied Digital a call. So today I'm going to be talking about the custom transport feature of PowerShell remoting. So PowerShell remoting, if you haven't ever used it, is a really neat technology that makes it so that you can have PowerShell either locally or remotely and lets you both fan out commands, do all kinds of neat things, and still stay within PowerShell. Rather than having to like SSH and do text and copy and parse all that, you can access remote machines and run commands and have the stuff come back and have it still feel like it's a local PowerShell session. And that's really powerful. Up until very recently, though, the way that this was implemented was in such a way that you pretty much could only use what was inside the core PowerShell source code unless you made a pull request. This involved things like WSMan, which is what most people are familiar with. If you've ever done remoting and you just put in a computer name and it just works and you're on a domain, you're using a very complicated technology called Windows remoting and WSMan that uses HTTPS and Kerberos and all kinds of crap to ultimately get you connected and back. Very complex technology, but works really well, works in a great enterprise. More recently, you've been able to do SSH. So if you have a host and you can SSH to it and you have SSH on your system, you can get that same kind of connectivity using SSH. More and more, we had more and more reasons that we wanted to be able to do more ways to get into things. Certainly, like with my company, apropos of that is that because we manage so many different infrastructures, we need lots of ways to, at scale, access systems, and especially if a system's having an issue, have a way for it to be able to like phone home and be able to access it. So we started talking with the PowerShell team about ways that we could do this, and there were some other companies having sort of a similar issue. And eventually they decided, okay, well, we have an idea how we can make this available without like doing a lot of breaking changes or implementing a lot of stuff that we have to do for long-term support. So in PowerShell 7.3, they made this available. If you go to this link, you'll see an RFC that explains all the detail about how it was implemented. It's a lot of very verbose detail, but basically what happened is that they took the core infrastructure that is where the transports were implemented from. There's a common class, and they basically made that public and some components of that public. So they didn't really have to change anything. They didn't really have to introduce any breaking changes. But what they did was they basically made it available so that you could implement your own custom transport. So when this became available in PowerShell 7.3, that was great. It's on the client side, which just simply means that the client now supports it so that your client can do any kind of custom transport that can be loaded as a module, and they can be written as modules. They're written as C# modules, not PowerShell modules. It can theoretically be possible to do it in all PowerShell, but it's probably going to be bad, slow blocking, it's hard. So in this case, we do it in C#. But the nice thing about this being is that the way it's implemented, the server side doesn't matter. So the server can be whatever you want. And what that means is that as long as it handles the PowerShell messages, there's nothing special you need to build into your module to do that. That doesn't really matter today, but in the future, it could mean things like there are implementations of PowerShell remoting for Python, and there are PowerShell implementations of PowerShell remoting for a couple other languages, so that you might actually be able to remote into a completely different language or have that language remote into PowerShell and be able to communicate between those as if you were just working with another PowerShell session or remoting to another PowerShell computer. So really neat stuff that makes possible. I'm going to be going through an example that I've implemented. If you want to see the base reference implementation that I used, Paul Higgin, who is on the PowerShell team and worked to make this feature available, he has a reference implementation that shows how to do this where just connecting to different PowerShells using named pipes. If you know what named pipes are, it's basically just this way of communicating between processes that's available on all operating systems. It's implemented differently on like Windows versus Linux, but .NET has like a common way of just handling, the differences. And in fact, every PowerShell process that gets created, if you go into Linux, you can see in the temp folder, you'll see these little named pipe files for every process you have running on your computer in PowerShell. If you're on Windows, you got to go a very specific, special place to see it. But basically, it's just piping and plumbing, and he made a way to be able to remote any process that's running to be able to get into it, maybe interactively debug it, any of that kind of stuff. So I'm going to start with kind of a high-level conceptual idea about how custom transports work. So what we are doing here is we have a client, and we have a server, and we want to remote to that server and connect to it. So this is the process that happens whether you're using WSMan, whether you're using SSH, or whether you've written your own. So when you're your client, the first thing that happens is you run your command. You run something like get child item, and then that command is going to get serialized into what's called a PSRP message. PSRP is just PowerShell Remoting Protocol. The PowerShell Remoting Protocol is just a series of XML messages that just go back and forth between the client and the server. So it takes your command, converts into this. A bunch of session setup stuff happens first where it contacts the server, does the authentication, verifies that the versions are the same. But then once the connection is established, now we're good to go. And now we're going to do something. This is where you do like invoke command dash computer name, whatever, get child item. And you want to see what files are on there or get process. So when you do that, basically that command gets converted into an XML that's what's called base 64 encoded, which all that simply means is that it's a way of encoding stuff so that all the special characters are removed. It's just like A through F and 1 through 9, so it's really easy to send back and forth without it causing code problems because you have a quote and I'm not expecting a quote and it crashes my program. So it gets all encoded in this really nice like XML format that's basically unintelligible if you're looking at it and you don't know how to decode it. And then it takes that and it passes it to this special kind of interface, which is a transport interface. So this is the main thing that you interact with. And this is all C# concepts. So again, if I say things like interface and virtual module, don't freak out if you don't know what those mean. We're going to show a little bit more about what those are. And you don't really need to understand them at this point to understand the concepts that we're working with here. So one thing you get is a text writer. A text writer is a special C# type of class that has just simply been implemented. It's actually an interface, but basically what it says is it's like a standard way of saying something, hey, I need something that I can write text to. If you provide me that thing to write text to, then I know that I can call this one method WriteLine, and I will know that we've agreed that if I call this method WriteLine and I give you a certain string, you know how to handle that and take it onwards. So they present that interface. They say, provide me a text writer. And so then when you write your thing and when WSMan and SSH providers, those are the pieces that plug into that. That say, when this message comes out, it's going to go into that. And so that's what happens. That guy gets kind of run into that text writer and then pushed in there. And this is the point where it gets handoff from the actual full PowerShell process to the custom transport handler or the SSH handler or whatever. So this is the point when your cute, handy, dandy little custom transport comes along. So this is the point that your code takes over and gets that message. So now that your transport gets that message, from this point on, from the PowerShell perspective, whatever you do, it doesn't care. You can just simply return the message back. You could make a fake, but whatever you implement at this point is whatever you want to do. So however you want to transport this from this client to the server, it's up to you. That's the kind of key point here. we kind of get bogged down in like there's all these details about this, but in the end, it's just an interface. It's like if I'm sending a package, to my grandma, once I hand it to the mail carrier, all I care about is that it gets there and that she sends me the package back, with all the empty wrappers and everything, because that's what she does. So at this point then, my transport's going to take that guy, and it's going to take it, drive it along, move it up there, and drop it right off at the server. Now, this is conceptually what you're doing, but again, you don't have to do this. But typically what you're going to do is you're going to have some way of getting this data across to wherever your server resides, whatever that is. For instance, with the WSMan transport, it hands off to WSMan, says send it to the server, does all that stuff through HTTPS. The messages go across securely over to HTTPS and then arrive on the other side. In the case of the SSH protocol, the SSH exposes these two little handlers for standard in and standard out. And basically what happens is that the custom transport portion here just then gives it to that SSH process, and the SSH has been instructed, hey, whatever gets fed in here, go through that special little SSH tunnel and hand it off to the server on the other side who's waiting for that XML message. So then your server, which is typically just a PowerShell process, another PowerShell process, but it doesn't have to be. Like I said, it could be Python, and as long as it's implemented the PowerShell remoting protocol, it can respond to those messages. In the same way, like when you make an HTTPS request, you might not know if the other thing's a Linux server or a Windows server or some other thing or a serverless framework, but as long as it can respond, knows how HTTPS works, and knows how to send a response to my GET request, I don't care. I'll be able to accept it. So while conceptually 99% of the time you're just talking to a PowerShell thing, the possibilities here are endless. Like if you just have something that implements the remoting protocol, you could have a REST API, for instance, that you could PowerShell remote, but it doesn't really use the PowerShell remoting. It all just kind of does that. In fact, the Exchange module, the new Exchange module, like the Exchange version 3.1 that is all like REST based, what it literally does is it sends a GET request, and the body of the GET request is just a thing that is whatever your Exchange command was. And then what comes back is actually CLI XML inside the REST command, which it just unpacks. So whereas that's not using the PowerShell remoting transport specifically, it's kind of doing like its own version of the same thing. If you ever watch the Exchange messages go back and forth with like Fiddler or something, it's pretty interesting. They're using a REST API kind of, but only in the sense that they're basically still just doing PowerShell underneath, talking to some PowerShell process somewhere and getting that CLI XML, which if you don't know what CLI XML is, it's basically just the XML representation of objects that happens in remoting. That it's like a JSON or that kind of thing that just describes what an object looks like. And then that comes back. So once we got that to the server, then the server gets the message. The server does whatever it is going to do with it. In this case, we're a PowerShell process. We did a get child item, and I'm returning the list of files that I asked for. That then gets converted back into a PS1 XML with the response, same thing that was done before, loaded up into the transport. Transport comes back, and then your transport, once it's done, your agreement with PowerShell is you say, hey, PowerShell says I have this handle data received method that I'm going to expose to you. After you get that message, once you get a message back, post it to this handler. It's almost like posting to a REST API in a way. And then once you do that, then PowerShell takes that, rehydrates the text into objects again, and then brings that back to the client, and then that's when you get displayed and you see your get child item. So when you do an invoke command or you do any of that kind of stuff and you're doing that like -computer name, or you're using like import module -use Windows PowerShell and using a module from Windows PowerShell, that's remoting. Whenever you're doing that stuff, you're basically following this basic process is what's happening. Obviously, there's a lot more steps, but that's sort of the main gist of it. So the key thing about this is that you notice that my transport had no idea about any of this other stuff that was going on. My transport, all it had to do was move XML text from one place to the other and return the responses. So when you're building this, you really actually don't have to understand how PowerShell remoting protocol works. All you have to do is ensure that anytime you're given a message, that it gets to the other side. And anytime that other side gives you a message, that you bring it back. But you don't have to know the contents. In the same way that HTTPS or TCP don't have to know like what the message body is of like an Azure function at that level. All it cares about is connecting to the remote site, sending that data stream of that GET request, responding, and I'm done. Like TCP doesn't even know what HTTPS is. It just knows it's some data that I'm being given that needs to go back and forth. And that's like that whole OSI model, separation of concerns, like you have transport layer and presentation. This kind of stuff is like presentation layer type stuff, whereas the actual transport is kind of like the transport layer stuff. We don't care what's going on with the PowerShell session itself. We don't even look at the connect and close messages. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is just to move these XML messages back and forth to make sure everything gets established. Quick break there for any questions about that. Yeah. Sorry? So the question is, will we have custom software on the server side? For the example that I'm going to show here for Posh Anywhere, yes, but that custom software is just a PowerShell script, and I'll explain why that is here in a minute. But it could be anything. It could be a REST API, it could be an ASP.NET server, it could be a Python process. The server side, and it doesn't even have to go over TCP. Like I said, the example that I showed earlier with named pipes, that all happens locally on your machine. And another one that I'm going to show also does that. So the key thing is to realize that this definition is very broad. So it's as far as your imagination can take you. And the reason I say that is that you might come up with a brilliant way of doing remoting that even, that I would have never even thought of. It's stuff like, some of the stuff that's happening with like ChatGPT and the way they implement that stuff. It's like, I just would have never thought of that. So I'm not going to tell you, you should do it this way or you should do it that way, because that's artificially limiting what may be possible that you can think of that I can't think of. All right, so when you are implementing this, then there are three main components you're going to see when we go into this. The first thing is the connection info. This is a C# class that defines what the run space is going to look like. Now, again, most of what this is up to you to define how you want to do it. Like if how you connect is a DNS hostname, you'll probably want to have a property in here for that. If how you connect is like the name of a pipe, you want to have a property in there for that. If how you connect is like an OAuth to Azure and then looking up virtual machine names and then looking for virtual machine names with a certain tag and then only showing those, you want those properties. I use that last one just as one of those, like something I've never even thought of. If your thing is going to AWS and listing a list of AWS servers and you expect to see the ASN of that individual server, and that's how you connect, then that's what you supply. It's just whatever your definition of connecting to that system is, that's what you define. The main thing that matters, though, is that so all that stuff's instant, but the main function that matters is there's one method on there, which I forgot to mention, but I'll show in a diagram. There's a method in there where it creates the transport manager. And so that's what PowerShell expects of you. It's like, hey, I expect you to give me connection info. I don't care whatever else you put in there, but I expect you to have a method that tells me how I create a transport manager using your object. And then I don't care how you build that. I don't care how you do any of that. I just need to know that I can do that so that now I can treat it as a run space and have all my stuff like invoke command and all that stuff, work within that concept. So then once you have a connection info, the next thing you want is a client session transport manager. So this is, again, a base class that gets provided to you, the base client session transport manager. That is basically provides you all the info that you need to know to implement. And that has a whole bunch of different methods, just like how I showed there, those two kind of key methods. This is where you implement those methods. This is where you have that text writer that will receive the data from your client, whoever's typing at the console. And then you have the other function that once your server returns the data or however you're handling the messaging, when you're ready to respond to the client saying, here's the response to your get child item, that's the other piece that you have to implement. There are a bunch of other pieces, like how you establish a connection. Like basically, like when a connection is established, does your thing need to do anything special? There's a hook for that. When the session gets closed, does your thing need to do anything special? There's a hook for that. But those are optional. You don't have to implement those. The key things you just have to have, like I said, is you have to have a way to accept XML messages that come from the client and a way to return XML messages back to the client. But to you, they're just strings. It's not even a special like class. It's literally both of these methods just take strings. So you're just getting a string, passing it on, and then getting a string back and passing it on. Like that's the core of what you're implementing is that. Then finally, you have the commandlets. So you technically don't actually need any commandlets when implementing a custom transport. The problem is that if you don't do it, it's really ugly to use your tool. It's really hard. You have to use .NET syntax of create run space. You have to specify the connection info. You basically have to have like this much code just to have somebody connect to your custom transport. So it's much better if you put that in a commandlet for something like new my custom session, and then handle all that for them, and then you put that blocker code in the middle once you've figured out how to handle it for them. And so typically when you do this, you're going to build a commandlet that's sort of like your UI or UX to the user for how they're going to connect. So this is one place where custom transports differ from the other ones. There is no native integration with invoke command. Like you can't have invoke command - custom transport the name of your transport. What you have to do is once you get the session, then you pass that session to invoke command, and I'll show what that looks like. So that's one thing that's a little different. Like normally when you're doing remoting, you're used to typing like -computer name if you're using WSMan, -host name for SSH. Because it was implemented that way, it's really hard to make that part of it pluggable. So the only way that they could do it with a minimum amount of breaking changes was to make it, hey, you just get the PowerShell sessions like when you build a bunch of different sessions, and then you just work with those sessions like you would normally. But you can't, there's no direct interface with invoke command until after you've established the session. So this is a diagram that is on the GitHub that for my Posh Anywhere that I made, because this is a complex process, and Paul does a pretty decent job of explaining it, but it is still really kind of complex. But basically what I show here is this is the process of what happens when you connect. This is not the process of moving the XML messages back and forth, because like I said, that part's fairly easy. But establishing a connection, the process of what happens inside PowerShell is kind of important to understand. So what I have here is there's a few main components that you want to know about. The things that are in blue are those three things I just told you about: the commandlet, the connection info, and the transport manager. And then the things that are not in blue are these are just representations to show you what PowerShell is doing. So there's a run space factory, and then there's a run space. If you don't know what a run space is, it's basically like a low-level version of like a PowerShell job. Every time you start PowerShell, in C#, there's this concept called a run space, which is basically just like a little container where your PowerShell code is run. And when you make new run spaces, those can run side by side. And that's why like when you do for each parallel, that like you can have things run in parallel. What it's doing is in the background, it's making multiple run spaces that are almost like independent little PowerShell entities, but they all share the same process so that they stay pretty fast, versus jobs actually spin up whole new PowerShell processes and have to load everything every time a new job is started. So that's just a simple, a light way of, if you don't know what run spaces are, that's the idea. Run spaces are entirely a PowerShell concept. It's not really a C# concept. And I should say a .NET concept, because there's no reason you couldn't write one of these in F# or VB or either, because it's just all .NET. But most likely you're going to write this in C#. So the way that this process works is the first thing is whatever your commandlet is, like in my case, if I make new custom session, my user runs my command and probably specifies parameter. Like as a simple example, they specify a host name. That's myserver.com. Using that info, I call a run space and I create a new run space using the connection info that I've made. My special connection info, and in there I'm going to put my special information, and my connection info that I've built has the information for how to create a transport manager. So once the run space factory has that, you see it passes through and it calls that method on your connection info. Once you do that, then once you call that method on the connection info, your connection info will start up your transport manager. And then your transport manager has that method that I talked about for create async, for creating a connection. Now that could just not do anything. Like it doesn't have to, but most of the time that's the point where you're actually going to, reach out, connect to the server, verify it's good, and if there's any issues, throw an error. So that if your user's trying to connect to the server and it times out or anything like that, you should be handling that at this point. Once that completes, then the client knows that things are good. The client session transport manager comes all the way back to the run space, and then it's going to do an open async, which is different than the create. For the purposes of this presentation, just assume that you're always doing a one-to-one relationship, but it's possible to have like a transport manager that handles multiple connections. You might want to do that for efficiency. You don't have to. It's very complicated to try to do. So for the purposes of this, don't try to do that. Just keep everything. Every time you make a new connection, make a new transport manager and handle it that way. If you need some intermediary thing to keep things efficient, handle it in your internal implementation details. So once that's done, once the run space connection info completes, then what the run space will do is it'll take that information and convert it to a PowerShell session. And then you'll be able to pass that back from your commandlet, and now your user has a session. So we're going to look at what that looks like here. So I will bring up my example here. So first thing I'm going to do, so this is going to be just a quick demo. I'm going to go more into like what the details are here in just a minute. But basically, this is my server. So what I'm doing is I'm pulling down a script. It's a bit.ly link, but it just goes to a GitHub, my GitHub for Posh Anywhere. And this pulls down a script that utilizes, starts this server. Now what it does is it starts up a server. None of this has anything to do with the custom transport at this point, but what it's doing is it's looking in my PowerShell, it's finding that named pipe that I told you about earlier and using that to talk to this PowerShell instance that's currently running. Like if I did PID and the process ID was, 5217, like it's the same process. So it's connecting to that named pipe, and now that it's got a connection so it can do remoting, it then also exposes a TCP port, in this case a WebSocket port. And then on top of that, I use CloudFlare tunnels, which are a rendezvous method. If you've used like VS Code Server, where it just phones out and then you're able to connect to your VS Code Server, it's kind of like that, but it's free. Azure Relay costs money. This doesn't cost any money. I'm cheap. I did it this way. So this is a way that basically it builds a rendezvous tunnel so that no matter where this is, it's phoning home over HTTPS. As long as I can get out by HTTPS to Cloudflare through a firewall, which is pretty common. Most of that stuff is just let open. You can do that, and now I have a point where I can rendezvous into this PowerShell session. So if I do a second one, and depending on the Wi-Fi, this part's still a little bit flaky, so we might have to give this a couple tries. But first I import my module, which should be, actually I think I have this in VS Code a little bit easier to look at. Okay, so this is basically the built version of my module. It's a PowerShell module, but it's all written in C#, and you can see all the kind of details over here of all the different parts. And so I have a lot of those same parts that I talked about. I'll go ahead and import that module. And now I can do new WebSocket session, which was from this. And I make it helpful, I give you the command that you need to run. Copy this. Paste it in. And if I'm lucky, it works. Okay. So now I have a run space. I have a run space connection. And if you go back to the server, I didn't do verbose, I don't think, so you're not going to see the connection. But basically what I'm doing, even though it's all on my local machine, is what's happening is that I'm making a WebSocket server. It's phoning home to Cloudflare. And even though I'm doing it on the same machine, I could have done it from any other machine, also a demo like that. I'm going out again to Cloudflare, meeting at that point, and now I have established a tunnel. And now that I've established a tunnel, I have a way for those PS1 XML messages to go back and forth. And in fact, at this point, about 10 to 15 messages have gone back and forth about creating the session, negotiating the version, making sure that I have the right PowerShell version, making sure that everything matches up so it's ready to receive commands. But again, I don't have to care about any of that. All I saw was that XML messages that look like garbage went back and forth, but I don't have to care about the internals. It's just my job to move that data back and forth. So now, in my server here, let's see if I can, this is probably gonna be a little ugly, sorry, but let me pop this up here. So on my server here on the right, so as I said, now that I have the sessions, there's my PowerShell session. I'm gonna just make this $S. So now I can do ICM session $S, get child item. And now I'm actually getting I'm just remoting just like you know any other kind of remoting, but this is not going through SSH or WSMan. This is using my custom transport using WebSockets. And I can even, I think I might have an example where you can write just to prove this. I can do console write line. Hello. I might have already lost my connection. That guy doesn't like it. Oh, see, I made it mad because I canceled it probably. Oh, there it is. Okay, so see where the hello came up? So even though I'm doing this locally, sort of on my computer, it's going out. I can show this, for instance, if I do a different server. SSH jgrote at tinycloud as an example. And this, because I wrote this script such that it works anywhere that there's a PowerShell session. It even works with PowerShell 5.1. So I can again do my IWR bit.ly/Posh Anywhere. And actually first let me enable verbosity so you'll see that. This is going to be a little slow because it's going all the way back to LA. So debug. So this should show a little bit more detail when I run it now. So there, and part of this also I didn't mention is that it also transparently goes and fetches the latest version of the the piece of CloudFlare that works, because they don't have a .NET version of it, but it's like a little Go binary. So as part of the process, it fetches that binary and gets it ready to go. So here we go. We have that verbosity. We have that connection. There's the WebSocket session. And so this is just on a server in LA. It's just a remote thing that I'm SSHing to, but I can come back to my local computer. I'll go and just do a new session here. See if I can steal my import command. Sorry if that's small too. There we go. And then copy my new session command. And it didn't like it. All right, well, what would have happened there usually, and sometimes it's a little flaky because I got the connection wrong or I cut and pasted it, but what happens is it'll rendezvous at this special webhook point, and then I would have had a connection to my local system. But you know, it works the same as what you saw when I did there locally. It's just in this case, that server is like further away. And again, this code is all done in a certain way that I might have some race conditions and whatnot, but that's just the way my implementation is. So the way that worked, just to go to the details here of like a simple transport, I'll show here a TCP transport. So you have all these things in terms of there's that close async, the create async, and here's where you're doing all that stuff and setting up the connection. And then this start reader thread is like the place where you start that connection, and now I'm tying into that text reader and make sure it's working. And I put it on a different thread so that it doesn't block what's going on in my current PowerShell. And you have the handle data received. There, this is that the other side of that handle, if you remember in the diagram where the data is coming back. So this is the part where it's listening, and then eventually when my server responds, it replies that back. So this part's all very complicated in terms of that. So I made a more different kind of interface that I will publish as a NuGet package that is a simpler way of doing this. So this is a simple transport manager. And so what it provides is it provides an interface that is basically just 4 methods, because without you even having to know what a text writer is, or without even needing to know any of those kind of things, you just need to implement 2 methods, a method that handles the data and a method that handles the data back, and optionally the whole create and close. And so for my WebSocket configuration, this transport is much simpler in that regard as a result. Here's each of those methods. My version here, if I find it here, see it implements that interface that I mentioned that I made to make all this whole process simpler and handle a lot of the back and forth you got to worry about. I then have this with my WebSocket. Handling data from the client is it just checks if the connection's open and then sends the data out. And then when data comes back from my transport, I basically get it on a stream. I read it in. I make sure that there's a lot of cancellation stuff in here. Here's where I read the data back in. And then I take that data and then I write it out. The WebSocket, the reason I chose, as a small aside, the reason that I chose WebSockets is because a WebSocket DLL exists in every version of PowerShell since PowerShell 5.1. So I don't have to install any NuGet packages. That's why this client works without having to have any kind of dependencies, because the server side that runs the WebSocket server can all be in PowerShell, because all the C# and binary stuff I need is already there, and I'm just calling the methods that already exist. Basically, it already has a WebSocket server built into it. So on this side, I'm using those same libraries, but this is like an older interface, so you got to do weird stuff like you got to actually like take this data that comes back and throw it into a buffer, and then take that buffer and then read it back out as a line. So this is like an implementation detail. It's like one of those ugly things you might have to deal with. But that will be entirely dependent on like how you're doing your transport part. And then of course, lots more error handling. Hey, if this closed normal, we're gonna handle it that way. Everything's good. If it's empty, have another error. But ultimately, we have that message coming back. And then down here is the connection info where I'm doing this, and I'm using, again, this same WebSocket client, which you'll see here. See where it says client WebSocket. I'm just using the library, and I'm making a connection. I have my URI, which is that part of my connection info, and as well as a cancellation token, so when somebody hits Control-C, it works. And then this is just some stuff to make async stuff work. You don't need to worry too much about what this means. PowerShell is not so good at handling asynchronous C# stuff like tasks, so sometimes you got to do some stuff like this to make it work. So that's just sort of the summary of like what the details are. You can go into the repository and see all the details of how it connects. But what's really nice about this is that the phone home aspect is really great. So an example of how I do this is that what I've used this for is I have like a GitHub action, and I have a PowerShell script and it's throwing an error and I have no idea why. So with this, if it throws an error, I can have a try catch that just calls this and starts a tunnel wherever that GitHub action is. And we also do this in customer environments, like wherever their server is, deep inside wherever that there was that issue, it can phone home. And now I have this way to rendezvous with it so that I can get in there. And now I have a full PowerShell session where I can interactively troubleshoot, I can run debugging, I can figure out what happened there and manage that. Another thing that we do with this is a sort of fan-out webhook. We don't use the CloudFlare thing, but we use just the raw WebSocket where we're able to, with HTTPS, basically have a bunch of different systems that like we're staging for a certain action, have them all phone home to our system wherever they are. And as long as they have HTTPS out, it's fine. Doesn't matter if they're on a domain, doesn't matter wherever they are. As long as that process is running, we can get into that. And then we can use that to then fan those commands back out in the same way that you do with normal PowerShell remoting, where you just take those sessions, you say for each session, do an invoke command. They all happen in parallel. I get all the results back. I have the PS computer name that says which computer that came back from, handle the errors, etc. So that's an example of a PowerShell custom transport and how you would implement one. As you can see, it is very detailed, it's very complicated, kind of hard to do in just 45 minutes, but at least hopefully you have an idea of what the concepts are and where things lie in there. So if you ever want to attempt this, you have a good place to start. And then I will provide more information from my Posh Anywhere for that simple transport that abstracts a lot of the stuff of like handling output, handling some conversion stuff, handling a lot of the connection stuff that can go wrong. I sort of like have done some stuff to make all that a lot easier. So thank you very much. We got a little bit of time for questions, but again, thank you very much for coming. So we got some time for questions, and if there's no questions, I can just go into some more detail around some of the internals and et cetera. So yeah. So the question is, if I wanted to try to just do Posh Anywhere from home, what would I need to set up in CloudFlare to make it work? And the answer is nothing. This uses CloudFlare quick tunnels. If you look up CloudFlare quick tunnels, it is basically a thing like if you've ever used anything like ngrok or things like that that just sort of make it so you can expose your internal web server outside. CloudFlare has a very nice commercial version that lets you register with it, use OAuth, good authentication and everything. But they have a version called quick tunnels where you can just expose an internal port, you know, through their CloudFlare system by just doing basically the command that I'm calling is like CloudFlare D serve port 7076 or something like that. And so as a result, you can do that with no authentication. They let you do that. Like they don't come with any kind of warranty or service agreement, but they work fine. So basically you can on your computer just go to, you know, first read my code, of course, don't run untrusted code from the internet, but go to, you know, just do that same bit.ly/Posh Anywhere or download my script and run it locally because you don't have to do that. It's just an easy way in. Run that script, start the server. It'll tell you what command you need to run to get into it. Unfortunately, at this point, because I haven't published the module yet, and I do plan to publish it very shortly after this conference, you should be able to do install module Posh Anywhere eventually and then do the new WebSocket session. For now, you actually have to build my source code and then run it to connect. So, but if you just wait until I publish the module, you just do install module Posh Anywhere, and then you'll be able to do connect web. It'll tell you what command, as you saw, that connect WebSocket session, and you'll be able to run that, and it'll just work. But you can run that server part. I purposely made it so that it has like 0 dependencies. It's literally just a PowerShell script, and it's an entire WebSocket server implemented, not like in PowerShell. It calls .NET stuff, but that's kind of a fun thing to look at too if you want to see how that works. It handles all the message handling, makes everything really fast, uses async, and it's a full WebSocket server in PowerShell, as well as a way to handle automatically fetching the latest release of something from GitHub. There's functions in there that do that because I get the latest version of CloudFlare. But that's an example of just like of a server, but it doesn't have to be that. It can be any kind of server you want to have. And so the client part was the part that we had to get to actually be able to work, because before you just couldn't implement that part. They just wouldn't let you do it. But now, because the parts that you needed to do it used to be sealed, which basically means in C#, like they don't let you implement that stuff. It's like a safety check that PowerShell makes so that you can't implement it. So they basically unsealed that stuff so that now we can do it. And that's where all this transport handler, this C# code part comes in. But again, to make a long story slightly longer, because none of my answers are ever under 15 minutes, you'll just run the server script and then eventually run new WebSocket session, and you'll be able to connect anywhere. You can connect from your work laptop to your computer at home. Basically, as long as both things can phone out HTTPS to Cloudflare, it'll work. And the other part, one more thing is, part of the magic of this and why I use Cloudflare is this is all still HTTPS encrypted over the internet. It's like, well, how do I do that without a third-party certificate? So the magic is what Cloudflare does is I expose a local unauthenticated WebSocket on your computer. It's on localhost, so it's not like another computer can come access it. Another process could, but it's so short-lived it shouldn't be a thing. And so that local web host, when I expose that to Cloudflare, Cloudflare puts an HTTPS certificate from their certificate authority in front of it. So you saw you got that random name.trycloudflare.com, which I can probably bring back up again here. I should have put presentation mode on. Yeah, so you see this random name, fragrance-enabled-joe-graduates.trycloudflare.com. That's the name that gets randomly generated. That's the name of my tunnel. And in fact, if I were to have the server running, you can actually browse to that in a browser, and it'll come up as with a 404 not found because you're not talking to it correctly. But it is all HTTPS encrypted, and because they control the name, they can just on the fly generate a certificate for it, and so that when you connect, you don't get any SSL errors from the WebSocket tool, because the WebSocket will freak out if you don't have a valid certificate. Yeah. There is a way to configure the name, but you can't use the free tunnels. So yeah, there is, when you do the Cloudflare server, it does have an option. I'll show you the code here and so the Cloudflare, so when I do that IWR, IEX, it comes to this script. And so as you can see, this script is about 500 lines of code, and it's a complete WebSocket server, TCP server, and the Cloudflare part. So if I skip all this stuff, come all the way back up here, there is an option here for, there's an option to disable the Cloudflare if you're just working local. There's an option to just do raw TCP. I did have an option here for name, but for the name part, I think this is in the version that I don't have committed here, because to do a custom name, you have to have a Cloudflare account. You have to authenticate to it. That's a whole nother bag of worms to make this work. So for now, and it's only really meant for quick ephemeral things. It's not meant for long-standing tunnels, because your only authentication basically is the name. You notice I didn't enter a username or password there. It's basically as long as you know what the tunnel name is, that's how you get into that process. So this particular implementation is just meant for ad hoc troubleshooting, where you're just bringing it up, you're immediately connecting to it. The second you connect, nobody else can connect to it. There's not really an easy way for anybody to dynamically discover these, so it's not really a security risk. It's like a VPN pre-shared key, basically. And but you could totally do that and have it custom named. Again, whatever you want to implement. It's literally, this is all just chains down from those simple methods that I called. This is all just a bunch of stuff past that. Oh, yeah, question. Yeah, again, it's literally anything I'm sorry, so the question was, can you implement authentication? So as I mentioned, I really want to emphasize on that slide, you can do whatever you want. So WebSocket does support basic authentication. So what I could have done here is I could have added a basic authentication. So in addition to knowing the string, you would need a username and password to get in there. Sure, you could do that, but how is that much better than having to know this random string that's extremely difficult to detect and only lives for 10 minutes? So yeah, you could have authentication. You could make it OAuth authenticated. Like I said, an example scenario here could be that you have a server, you have a process that goes to all your servers that have managed identities and starts your custom transport on them. And then you have a client where you do new Azure Server VM session, and you do dash and you hit tab, and when you hit tab, your your custom transport goes and discovers those servers, finds the ones with managed identities, makes sure that you can authenticate to them with your connection, and then brings up that list. And then we hit enter, you connect, and it just works, but it's in the back end using your custom identity. Again, the possibilities are whatever you want to implement. As long as you just implement the main UI, it's whatever you can implement. If you want to do OAuth, if you want to do HTTP, just if you can write it in C#, you can do it. And you can write pretty much anything in C#. So, yeah, one more question. Yeah, so this one's sort of a more contrived example, but if you look here, I have Posh Anywhere has a lot of like examples here in terms of like connecting to like a process. Like I have a version where you can just basically, it's a generic like any stream rather than the weird text writer and then the method. If you know how streams work, then you can just use this one, build a transport and just give it a stream, and now you have a remoting protocol in that stream. So for the TCP transport, this one, it literally just opens a raw, rather than do the WebSocket thing and rack it in WebSockets and do all the WebSocket method, it literally just opens a raw TCP port. And that raw TCP port gets piped directly into the named pipe so that when your client's talking to it, this is about as bare bones as it gets, is it's literally just the plain text going into the named pipe and into the process. The PowerShell process, your request, your get child item, and then it coming back just through that raw TCP pipe. So you can do that. It's insecure as hell. Don't do it like in any production environment. But it's mostly there because it's easy to see, it's easy to troubleshoot. You can Wireshark it and see all the PowerShell messages go back and forth. And so this is like a good, easy one to look at. And if you look at the code, it's not that big. Like, it's literally just open a TCP connection, start some stream writers that hook into those two messages things that I told you about, and then bind them together to the process. Like, it's 80 lines of code and you have a custom transport. So that's an example of a simple one. The WebSocket is an example of all this extra stuff to make something that's like really useful. Does that make sense? Any other questions? All right, thank you again.